Welcome to Green and Gold FC. I'm delighted to have Mark Crowe today. He is Managing Director of Brand Finance, and we want to chat about some of the internal questions facing football. How do we cut through? Here's a great question. We covered so many topics, had very interesting thoughts. It was very, very interesting, though, to hear some of his skepticism about both A-League expansion, having two divisions, as well as promotion relegation from a brand financing point of view, because as you know, we've had economists come on this show and be strong advocates of promotion relegation. Those, of course, are two different fields. So it's no surprise if two different fields disagree about something, because they're looking at basically two different parts of the puzzle. And it also makes sense that your brand finance expert would be more in line with a smaller A-League, where you can have those small brands of one club per town and only a limited number of brands. And in the end, you have to say that if your goal is to make it as big a brand as possible for these individual clubs, it worked, at least initially, which is very interesting. It's a shame the pod, we had a time limit. We wanted to get to 35 minutes. We actually went slightly over, because it did lead me to some questions about whether there's some challenges of not having promotion relegation, even within the domain of expertise of brand finance. For one thing, you're going against football's global brand by not having promotion relegation, and you see the division and protest that brings, and the reluctance and apathy that brings amongst the football community. The second thing, which I think is interesting, is that in a closed shop, there seems to be a conflict between the national team brands, the interests of the national team brands and the interests of the club brands. Think that when the A-League brands were strongest, that was when we were producing the worst talent. And vice versa. Now that the A-League's struggling, we're producing much better talent. In a promotion relegation, you have lower tiers, which you lower teams down. You also have smaller clubs who's going up, whose only strategy for surviving in upper leagues is to develop players. And we've seen historically, some of the weaker brands being the best at development, whether that's St. George in the old NSL, or if you're talking about, I believe that's Sunshine St. George, Kevin Muscat's club. And in the new era, you have Central Coast, one of the weakest brands, punching above their weight in youth development. So it's a shame I didn't get asked more questions on that. I hope we discuss in the pod. Now, of course, we discuss many topics, not just that, but I hope you find that interesting. Anyone who knows me personally know that I'm an advocate of promotion relegation, but it's interesting to hear, at least in the part where we covered that, where his skepticism was from in his field. Hope you enjoyed the pod. Football Australia recently posted back-to-back deficits despite having a record $140 million in revenue. There's been focus on the spending side of it. That's understandable. Martin Kugler has announced 20% of cuts to employees, and Samantha Lewis's excellent reporting highlighted some deep concerns about precisely what they're spending the money on. However, in the lead up to the World Cup, I want to ask the question about the revenue side of things to make sure we aren't leaving any stones unturned. So I'm joined here by brand expert Mark Crowe to come have a chat with us about the branding of the Socceroos and Matildas, as well as our domestic leagues. How are you going, Mark?
Very well, thank you, Graham. Thanks for having me on.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you and your company does, as well as their role in looking at branding and getting revenue out of Australian sport?
Sure. So, brand finance is a valuation consultancy where we look at brands within the corporate sector, but also very much so in the sporting world, in terms of valuing those brands, understanding what's driving the value of those brands, and in particular looking at how strong the brands are in terms of the ability to hold favourable perceptions of the stakeholders who contribute to those brands. But importantly too, we look at brand within the context of how it contributes economic value to the business it operates in, or to the owner of that brand. And in particular, and more so in focus with tonight's discussion, we focus a lot on sport because sport is where brands are critical to success. And they are really, in many respects, the, the bridge between combining what are the two key elements of sport is being able to get the right mix between economics and emotion and being
So
able to do drive value.
So I wanted to pick your brain here. We often feel like we are underperforming in terms of how much money we get for in our sport, and I want to start with some numbers. So cricket Australia and rugby Australia, these are very similar, in my view, very similar brands in the fact that they are national teams first with a domestic product which is mostly there to serve the national teams in its current setup. Most of the money seems to be in the national teams. And I want to give some numbers. So just looking at Instagram followers, Cricket Australia has a whopping 1.8 million followers, whereas Football Australia has two national teams, which has roughly the same number of followers as the Wallabies. So Wallabies has about 500K, Matildas 750K, and Socceroos about 400K. So two roughly the same size. Um, so when I add sponsorship and TV revenue, which roughly I would imagine is most of the money getting out of your brand, Wallabies get roughly 100 million a year. Cricket Australia gets roughly 300 million a year, and football just 70 million. I know this isn't an apples to apples comparison, but just looking at that, it looks like we are significantly underperforming how much revenue we are compared to other national teams. Do you get that sense, or am I overreading into Instagram followers?
No, that's a fair read. And I do appreciate your comparison of football with rugby because of that predominance of the national sides. And in many respects, that's often seen as a strength for both of the codes. However, the problem with investing too much in your national team is that you are restricted as to how much content you can then provide to the media. National teams, by their very nature, don't play that often. They're not like clubs. Uh, so, therefore, the opportunity to drive media, to drive consistent content across any number of months is limited. Uh, on top of that, because they're very much internationally focused, those teams, whether it be in football or rugby, are often playing in markets in the early hours of the morning in Australia. So the value of that is not as high as it would be um, at peak viewing hours. So the sports that do well are often the ones that get a good balance of international exposure but have it very much underpinned by a strong club competition, which is very much the case in European football, where you have very strong leagues that are played over up to 10 months of the year. And then on top of that, you have a very strong international content. In Australia, it tends to be the case that it's one or the other. So in rugby and football, the focus tends to be at the international level. In AFL and NRL, they have a stronger focus on club content. And the benefit for those two codes is that club content is something they can offer over 8 to 9 months of the year in season. And even then, in the other 3 months of the year, they can generate further content. And that's why AFL and NRL dominate in the Australian market, along with cricket, which again has been able to promote its international side, but has done very well with the advent of the Big Bash League, where there's a club focus as well. That's a fairly quick uh, um, description of the major sports. And I think in many respects, the biggest challenge for a lot of sports in Australia is that the AFL and NRL are getting bigger and they are taking up more and more of the media dollar. Cricket is in a comfortable third position there, but the consumption of that media dollar is making it more and more difficult for rugby, football, netball, uh, and other sports who are trying grow their to grow their content. And at the end of the day, most of your revenue is going to come through media rights.
So do you think, you mentioned that we don't have a strong club culture compared to Europe in football in Australia, and I guess that's similar to rugby union, with most of the money coming through the national teams. Do you think it's easier to build on a strength and maybe using maximizing the revenue that we get out of the national teams and using that to help build that level below? Or do you think most of the work needs to be done on trying to improve the brand of the domestic product?
I think ultimately you've got to try and do both. For football in Australia, clearly it is always going to have an element of a top-down approach. If the Socceroos perform well, if the Matildas perform well, that leads to a big spike of interest in the sport itself. Obviously, in the next few weeks, there's that opportunity for the Socceroos to be platformed on essentially what is the biggest stage in world sport. And a lot, obviously, as it is always the case, depends on field performance. But if they can get through and go deep into the tournament, that then should be used as leverage to what um, Football Australia can do locally to try and convert that success. One of the problems is that for many people who will follow the Socceroos and or the Matildas, if you ask them what their favourite club is, they may well answer with an AFL club, an NRL club, or even a Premier League club. The fact that they follow and are quite engaged by the Socceroos or Matildas doesn't necessarily lead them to adopt a A-League club, for instance, as their preferred um, preferred following. So that's, but on the other hand, that's a good thing that in many respects, football can often leverage people who don't ordinarily follow the sport and are more rusted onto AFL or NRL, but they'll get behind the Socceroos or the Matildas because they have that strong national identity and compete on the world stage.
So you mentioned performance being something which the brand can be sensitive to. I'm really curious how much the performance can impact the brand. I look at rugby union in inflation adjusted dollars. They're getting roughly three times as much as what they are now 20 years ago, and that's in that period they've dropped from eighth in the world to third in the world. Uh, but there seems to be two factors in football compared to rugby union. So in rugby union, if we have players like, I can remember players from 20 years ago, players like Mark Latham. Actually, I think that's the former leader of the Labour Party. Sorry, but Latham was his was his last
He
name.
did play rugby at club level.
Oh, there you go.
Mark Ella.
Yeah, I'm showing my ignorance of rugby union. But there's no Manchester City, there's no Liverpool United or anything. They're not playing. There's no clubs playing for those levels. So in 2006, we have players playing for the biggest clubs in the world. You know, we have Harry Kewell, who's playing for Liverpool. We have Mark Viduka, who's I think is at Newcastle at that stage, and Tim Cahill at Everton. And they achieved a round of the 16 finish. 20 years later, in 2022, sorry, I guess that's 16 years later, you have a bunch of players which are basically nobodies, but they get the same result. So you have like higher prestige players in the first instance with a good result, and then low prestige players, which are getting the same result. How much does the result matter compared to the prestige of the players, do you think?
Both matter. That's for sure. And I think it's always instructive to note the saying that, what's your best marketing plan? It's to win. A winning team is very easy to market. And to your comment about the Wallabies, say compared to the Socceroos, even though the Wallabies have declined in terms of performance in recent years, because the international scene in rugby is still dominated by what one may say is the traditional 8 countries, and in terms of competitive countries, once you start to get outside of the top 10, it does start to fall away fairly quickly. So the Wallabies, even though 20 plus years ago they were number one in the world, and now they've dropped down quite a few places to 6, 7, or 8, they're still quite highly ranked. And they also still play the majority of their test matches in the home market in Australia. The Socceroos, of course, are in a far more competitive environment where, as we know, and this in part goes to the nature of the game, the number one ranked international football team in the world can still be upset by the team that's ranked 30 or 40, or that team can even achieve a draw. That's just something that would never happen in rugby. So the Socceroos are somewhat vulnerable to the fact that they are in such a competitive landscape, and they can play a team 20 rankings below them and still not be assured of an easy victory. So in that sense, it's that performance on field is important, but at the same time, the degree or margin between winning and losing is very, very fine. I think also too for international football, it's very much focused on the World Cup, which is only once every 4 years. Beyond that, there's the Asian Cup for the Socceroos, but that doesn't enjoy anywhere near the same status as the European equivalent does. So I think, again, it's this content issue. There just isn't enough content where the Socceroos can, feature at home over many weeks of the year against top-class opposition that's going to bring, the eyeballs and the nation along.
Fair enough. So one thing we used to have in the 90s was regular participation in youth World Cups, and in particularly the Olympics, where the Olympics is obviously a platform which is nearly as big as the World Cup. So we haven't qualified very regularly for the Olympics, and we haven't appeared just as much. Uh, is there a possibility of turning those national teams into brands? I know even the under-20 World Cup is quite well attended and quite watched around the world. And of course, the Olympics is huge in Australian culture. If we qualify more and start going deep in the tournament like we did in the 90s, is there an opportunity there to get more content?
I think there's some great stories and narrative around those types of tournaments because, again, you are on the world stage. Perhaps continuing on the thread I raised earlier, the challenge, of course, is that over the last 20 years, since when you referenced Harry Kuehl, etc., more and more nations are becoming competitive at football. So when Australia qualified for the World Cup in 1974, there were only 16 teams in that World Cup. If the World Cup today only allowed for 16 teams to qualify, some teams that could possibly win the World Cup may not even qualify. So again, it's that there's been such a big uptick in competitive nations outside the traditional markets of Europe and South America that now compete as well. So whether it's at youth level or in senior football, it's just so much more competitive. And that's why in some respects Australia doesn't do as well as it used to in those youth tournaments because the competition is a hell of a lot stronger now. And in many respects too, that's also had a detrimental effect on the number of places available to Australians to play in some of the bigger leagues overseas. I mean, look at the Premier League in the UK. That essentially is a global league now. And the number of nationalities represented in the uh, Premier League is huge. Um, you know, over 100 countries are represented. So there's fewer places now for the what would have been the Kills or the Vidukas of yesteryear.
So if we let's move on to how to leverage the national team in order to promote the domestic leagues. Uh, is there anything? Suppose we have a successful World Cup. We had a successful-ish World Cup 4 years ago. Is there anything that we could do differently or we could do better in order to use that to generate more interest in the code as a whole, as well as our domestic leagues?
Yeah, I think it, obviously the opportunity lies in the fact that we play in the Asian conference. And I think when we moved from Oceania to Asia, that was very much seen as a significant move that would bring a lot of economic benefit. It may have made competing a lot more difficult, but obviously you're compared to the Oceania, you're playing in a far bigger economy when it comes to Asian football. I think in many respects that hasn't been as leveraged as well as it could have been. I think it's partly challenged by the fact that for many Australians, when they look overseas, they don't look to Asia, they look to Europe when it comes to football. And in particular, as I've already mentioned, the UK Premier League. But when you're looking at world economies, Asia is a powerhouse. I mean, half the world's population is, you know, in just two countries in Asia. And in some respects, Australia does benefit from any improvement in Asian countries, whether it be Japan, South Korea, and maybe further down the track one day, China and India, because if those countries start to do well, that will really lift the economic value of the um, excuse me, of the market which the Socceroos operate in. But again, it also gets back to how you can leverage that interest in the Socceroos into club-based content, which in Australia is the two A leagues, men and women. That's the big challenge. A League has partly an advantage that it doesn't directly clash with the AFL or NRL seasons, but in some respects, it's been challenged by the rise of the Big Bash League in cricket, which has taken up a lot more content in summer that originally the A League was starting to take ownership of. So, um, at the end of the day, for soccer, football, that is, to uh, really go to the next level in Australia, yes, you want performing national teams, but at the end of the day, you want that strong club content because you can't always rely on the Socceroos or the Matildas to go deep into tournaments. Um, so ultimately, if you want to grow the game in terms of the Australian economy, it's got to be club based.
So let's move on to then club base, how to grow the game there. What do you think we are doing well when it comes to our branding, and what do you think we could do better in order to improve the amount of revenue there is in the club part of the system?
I think it's fair to say the first few years of the A League was a really promising time. Average attendances were increasing. A lot of the teams had really good, strong brand identity, strong association with place branding in terms of the cities or they operated out of. It had the benefit of having quite a consistent spread of clubs across the nation, whereas with AFL or NRL, there does tend to be um, a leaning towards um, a few markets, not all markets, um, although both codes are trying to expand in that respect. But football does have that similarity to cricket that it can, um, it has support that in many respects is consistent across the nation. Um, and it's that ability to then really harness that. And at the end of the day, what drives a lot of interest in sport is rivalry, and it's really driving those rivalries, which have, in some respects, have fallen to the wayside. You know, the big rivalry between the two Sydney teams, Sydney and Western Sydney. Um, that was getting to a point where they were saying we'll have to move all the games to Accor Stadium because we're getting attendances of 50 to 60,000. Uh, similar to what was happening in Melbourne between the two Melbourne sides. I think the A League, in many respects, tried to grow too quickly, and as we've seen, there has been teams that have um, fallen out of the league. That's led to a lot of cost issues. I think, in many respects, and easy to say in hindsight, there should have been a greater focus on building the original 8 to 10 brands and getting them really strong before expanding. The addition of a third team in the Sydney market and a third team in the Melbourne market has been very challenging. Obviously, the um, Western United have now dropped out, and clearly in the Macarthur Bulls, they've yet to really drive a level of engagement that would assure their long-term sustainability. So, um, obviously, the A League, whether it be by choice or not, is having to consolidate, but it's really investing a lot of time in that brand identity to build up those strengths of their traditional teams, but also drive that um, advantage that one city teams have too, whether it's the Brisbane Roar, Newcastle, uh, Adelaide, etc., where they offer the opportunity for a city for everyone to get round one team. I think that has considerable upside if it's marketed well.
One thing we found when we went to one city per team, having very few teams in the National League, um, was we found this awkward trade-off between the quality of our domestic league, well, quality in terms of its brand, not necessarily what's on the park, and the quality of our national leagues, because that meant there was very few places for young players. Most countries which we're competing with have second and third divisions where young players can get experience before coming up the ranks, and more, and usually up to 18 teams in the top division with a long season. And so our Socceroos ended up crashing. Um, it, it it seems that there was a big trade-off between the domestic league and the national league. Now, funny enough, that our domestic league is really, really struggling. We're starting to produce quality Socceroos again because they're forced to play young players and sell them overseas. Um, that I imagine that puts some tough decisions in the hands of decision makers. Do you have any advice about how to balance these trade-offs, or how to avoid the trade-offs? Maybe there's a way to avoid it.
Well, I think concentrating on a few brands has an advantage, particularly from an economic point of view, but it also has an advantage when it comes to quality, that you can really drive home that people are watching the best of the best when it comes to the Australian market. So there could well be an argument that 10 to 12 teams is the maximum that the A League can sustain at the moment. There is aspiration to grow the league to 16 clubs, but will that dilute the quality? And with quality dilution, will that then endanger the viability of some of the teams that continue to stay at the bottom of the league? I think Um, there are examples from both the AFL and NRL where they do look at equity policies in terms of um, even distribution of players, strict enforcement of salary cap, the ability of teams that uh, um, are performing at the lower end to get additional funding or incentives to grow the business, but always run under very strict centralised control, where the finances of the teams are heavily scrutinised. So in the AFL or NRL, it's far less likely that there'll be any surprises when it comes to the economic health of one of the clubs. Those central bodies will know very early on if there are cash flow issues. Um, in the A League, it's more of a mystery, and I think that's where strict enforcement of standards is really got to come into play. I think there also needs to be, stating the obvious, a very cohesive approach to how football is run and managed in Australia, which really does point towards it all being run under the auspices of Football Australia. Now, people may argue there are reasons why it shouldn't be, but in a small market like ours, you only need to look at the codes that are doing well. Again, AFL, NRL, and cricket, and they're all run under one centralised body. Australia is a small market, relatively speaking, when on the world stage, but it's also a big continent, and there are a lot of travel costs for teams in terms of playing in a national sport. So that's another thing one needs to be mindful of. But if you're going to drive media rights, you've really got to make sure you're achieving optimal quality in terms of players. And at the moment, that probably points to a league that at best can sustain 10, maybe 12 teams, which obviously includes the two New Zealand teams, which we think um, is a positive in terms of growing that market, but also having the ability to tap into another player market as well.
Another issue which the sport faced was 20 years ago and again 10 years ago were divisions in our game. And those divisions basically came out of decisions which were conscious about our brand. So 20 years ago, there's a decision to get rid of clubs which had a strong association with one particular migrant community. That was a process which started 30 years ago in the mid 90s and then culminated in the launch of the A League, which had zero clubs from that. And then 10 years ago, there was a concern that active support and some of the media coverage they were getting was also hurting the brand. Yeah, at the same time, the decisions which were made to protect the brand of Australia, football in Australia, has created divisions which have never healed. Some have left the game, lost interest. Some of the most passionate fans have lost interest, and other fans have shown interest in their grassroots club but are angry at football in Australia. Uh, how much is division costing us? And if you excuse a double barrel question, how should football in Australia, those governing, weigh up the cost of division versus concerns about the brand?
Well, division is normally based on a lot of passion. Uh, and that's a good thing because people are invested in the sport. They are heavily invested in the sport. Perhaps in many respects, they're more invested in their club than the overall health of the sport, but that's across all codes as well. Um, it's the harnessing of that passion. As I said earlier, sport is a heady mix of economics and emotion, and you've got to get both right, and you've got to be able to manage both equally as well. So the emotion is very much the area that the brand is the repository for. It harbours all those emotions and hopefully favourable perceptions. The challenge with brands that are narrow in their focus is that in terms of a sport that wants to grow, there is a limitation on that. And whether this is fair or unfair, um, football has probably suffered from the main media, who often had a vested interest in one of the major football codes, always taking some delight in any level of division that occurred within football, whereas division in AFL or NRL, and let's face it, there's arguments in those sports every week, that's nearly platformed as entertainment. Um, Whereas with football, it's seen more to be narrow interest, not representative of what might be seen as the general public. So I think for football, it's got to be, at the end of the day, a focus on where market growth is, where the appeal is for the youth, uh, because they're the people at the end of the day, the youth, teenagers, people in their early 20s who are still impressionable, who are still open to the idea of not necessarily following the club that their parents did, um, or even their friends did at the school they may have attended, or from other sources. That's the opportunity to harness those people who are not rusted on to a particular code. Um, so in many respects, if you're looking at to where growth is, it's not going to be found in division or narrow market focus. The Australian market just is not big enough to cater for a league which could have a mix of what might be deemed to be new football clubs and old soccer clubs. There just isn't the economic platform to make that viable to have both represented. So um, I think in many respects the onset of the new second division is probably a halfway mark. But also too, where Australia differs from other overseas football leagues is we don't really entertain promotion or relegation.
Yeah, speaking of promotion relegation, it's often a very passionate subject. Uh, I had a sick day the other day, and I played an old video game from 20 years ago. It's a game for those at home who know it. It's called Civilization 4, and you get to basically be a government running your own little country. And the way they model democracy is that if another country has democracy, that it has its own intrinsic benefits. That's true, and has its own intrinsic costs, just like any governance system with net benefits. But the main cost, one of the biggest costs, is anyone who doesn't have democracy. It causes unrest and anger amongst the population. So you have to say, "Oh, I have an unhappiness penalty." It kind of reminded me of what promotion relegation does to the fan base in Australia. So uh, other sports, AFL, NRL, they aren't in international competitions where the national team has to be benefited by promotion relegation. And secondly, they're not used to thinking of promotion relegation; they can live without it. Whereas in football, they're used to promotion relegation being the norm. And so it seems to me, just talking to fans, that one of the biggest losses of promotion relegation is the fact that other countries have it and we don't, and it causes division, it causes frustration, causes anger. Um, do you think that there's a unique cost to not having promotion relegation in football compared to other codes, due to basically the fact that in the minds of football fans is going to be compared with other countries, setting aside, of course, the intrinsic benefits and costs of promotion relegation?
Yeah, the challenge within an Australian market is you always want, from a media point of view, to have a presence in the major TV markets. Promotion and relegation doesn't guarantee that. And there's always a risk with promotion and relegation that you'll get a heavy concentration of clubs within, say, two markets like a Sydney or Melbourne. which can then undermine your national reach. Um, the benefit for an AFL or an NRL in not having promotion relegation is it is a greater incentive in terms of their ability to attract private investment in their clubs, because investors are less likely to invest in a club if there is that high risk, that lack of performance on the field could result in relegation. And relegation in Australia would be down to a league which probably would change completely the economic model for that club. It's not like in the UK where relegation from the Premier League to the Championship is not the death of a club. It's actually often seen as an opportunity for the club to regroup, because the Championship over there is an incredibly viable league, where um, the clubs are still able to operate, especially with parachute payments. They can manage that drop. In Australia, to try and set up an A League which had promotion and relegation to what might be a deemed second division, the ability of that second division to keep a, a, a relegated A League club economically viable is extremely questionable. We're having a discussion about how viable is an A League of 10 or 12 clubs to try and promote the idea that you could have two leagues with promotion and relegation between the two of, say, 20 to 24 clubs and make that economic viable. The Australian market is just simply nowhere near having the ability to generate the revenues to sustain that. In many respects, the Australian market looks more to the American style model of sport, where all the major leagues over there, the four big leagues, they just don't have a history of promotion or relegation. And of course, the MLS doesn't have promotion or relegation either. So it just isn't economically viable in a market like Australia to introduce promotion relegation. Um, and I just don't see that being feasible for at least another 10 years, more likely 20. And that's assuming that football is able to grow substantially and sustainably over that period of time. The focus has to be on just making the A League sustainable with the clubs it currently has. And that's probably going to be at least a 5-year journey.
So, uh, speaking of again promotion relegation, we have launched a national second tier, which is often seen as an important step of development, as well as healing some of those divisions, and perhaps down the future a step towards promotion relegation. Um, but apart from just the development and the community aspects of it, is there any opportunities to commercialize it, or is this mostly just a part of a broader development strategy?
The opportunity to commercialise is, um, in many respects, dependent upon the opportunity to commercialise the A League, because it'll be, in many respects, a top-down approach. If if the A League can become commercially viable, then there would be the opportunity to create that link with the so-called new second division. On its own, to what extent the second division can drive independently its own revenues, um, I'm not seeing where that's going to come from. To the extent that it may have to rely upon funding from Football Australia, that's going to be challenging. As we have noted, Football Australia's finances is not looking at new ways to part with money. So again, that is essentially another roadblock for at least the next 4-year cycle. Um, to your point, and I think it's a good one, the extent to which the second division can promote what might be traditional rivalries that it can promote, that it is closer to being the community game that many people cherish. There's opportunity there, but at the end of the day, our view is there would be a fairly low limit on to what extent they can grow those opportunities. I think in the first instance, to run a national uh, season length second division is going to take a lot of goodwill, and it's going to take a lot of ingenuity in terms of being able to drive um, engagement, uh, and also in terms of positioning. Will it be more being seen as an alternative to the A League for people to who may not necessarily be attracted to the A League, may see benefit in being attracted to the second division? That's a question mark. Uh, to the extent that they can build an identity and get to the point of having a sustainable national second division in a 5-year period, um, and that would be really aiming at drawing crowds of at least an average of 5,000 people, which we know at the moment not even some A-League clubs are able to generate. So significant challenges. And as I said before, the football economy in Australia is not strong at the moment by any means. So it's not going to be done through investment. It's got to be through organic growth.
So let's wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, is there anything we know that the A League clubs have been uh, in decline in terms of their brand? If you're, say, advising, say, Brisbane Roar, let's choose the club I go, how can, on an individual level, these clubs arrest that slide and turn it around?
At the end of the day, I'm still optimistic about the long term future of the A League. They've certainly got to get themselves to a sustainable position, but as I said before, they need to first and foremost ensure that they get to a level of quality that is going to attract people who want to watch skillful football, even though it's accepted that good players, the reward for developing good players is to lose them eventually overseas. The importance is, in some respects, is to not necessarily compete with the other football codes, but see themselves as complementary. Uh, and that people who may follow an AFL or NRL club very much, a bit like the BBL. The BBL, in some respects, has done well in terms of that entertainment side, engagement side, and not seeing themselves as being competitors to NRL or AFL, but really promoting the fact about place branding, strong brand identity, owning the city, or in the case of Sydney, where you've got a very strong demarcation between Sydney and Western Sydney. I think Melbourne requires more work in terms of how the two Melbourne clubs are positioned. Uh, I think in some respects, the strength of Melbourne City being owned by the City Group brings advantages, but it can also lead to, dare I say it, some division of people who may see the association, particularly with Manchester City, as not something they're prepared to countenance, given they may have a uh, team in the Premier League uh, and it's not Manchester City. So uh, it, at the end of the day, getting back to our original discussion, it is leveraging the Socceroos and the Matildas, but it's not about just international football. It's leveraging that engagement. And Australia, at the end of the day, some of the research we've just done on the World Cup coming up, more Australians than just about any country in the world want to go out and watch the Socceroos in live public event areas. People will flock to, and partly it's because the Socceroos are playing at favourable times. But they will get enormous engagement. The trick then is to make sure that all those people who attend don't go back to watching Collingwood or the Brisbane Broncos, but plant that seed that, yes, continue watching the Broncos or Collingwood, but at the same time, really drive the identity of the A-League clubs and really start to associate the A-League clubs with the Socceroos or the Matildas.
So thanks so much for joining us, Mark Crowe. So there's if you have opinions about anything which was said, whether you agree or disagree, don't forget to join us on greenandgoldfc.com. That's the forum where you can give your opinions, no matter how spicy they are. So we also have, we're on Twitter, we're on Spotify and Apple, as well as YouTube. Please hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, that's all we have time for. Is bye for now.